John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. And today we're reading Hellblazer issue 88, which is the finale of the Eddie Campbell Hellblazer arc. I guess he was just kind of filling in for 5 issues in between Garth Ennis and Paul Jenkins, who's going to take over as the main writer for a while. And just a little catch up on what's been going on in this Eddie Campbell arc. John has been recruited by a ghost named Sir Francis Dashwood, who in his time, which I think was the 1700s, ran a thing called the Hellfire Club. He was potentially into some kind of occultic magic. And the ghost of him was telling John that the world was going to come to an end. And John believed him because all these weird things started happening around him. Usually they involved urban legends coming true. So what Sir Francis was saying seemed on the up and up. So John kind of joined his little mission to stop the end of the world from happening. So their plan for John is that he will do some sort of spell once he has circumnavigated the globe, which I guess is important to the spell. And while John was never really quite gung-ho about this mission, he figured, it's the end of the world, I better do something. But throughout these last couple issues, we've seen John get suspicious of the motives of Sir Francis Dashwood. And in the last issue, John ended up putting all the puzzle pieces together and figured out that all the strange occurrences that were happening were actually being caused by Francis to trick John into doing this spell. We're not 100% what the spell will do, other than it will open a gateway to something that will probably mess up the world in some way. And since he was on his trip already circumnavigating the globe, he was in Australia when he figured this out. So he came up with a plan to get Sir Francis to follow him to Papua New Guinea. And that is where we left off on the last issue, with John securing a ride to Papua New Guinea, and hopefully Sir Francis will follow him there. So first things first, with issue 88, we got the cover. We see John and Sir Francis are in some sort of jungle, and Sir Francis, being a ghost, is coming out of a tree trunk. And John is leaning over and he is lighting Sir Francis on fire. And the ghost of Sir Francis is going up in a blaze. And we also see that this is written by Eddie Campbell with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the first page, we see John is waiting on a dock next to a medium-sized sailboat, and there's a man and a woman that are loading gear into it. And the man says to the woman, "Look after the palm, Delvine. Keep him out of the sun or he'll peel." And as he's saying this, he's motioning to John, and the woman replies, "No worries." Then she turns to John and asks, "Where'd you get that moon tan, matey?" And I had to look that up. I never heard of a moon tan before, but apparently it's another way to say that you look very pale. And John answers her sarcastically, "A week at the Butlins." And as Delvine continues to load the boat, she asks him, "What's a Butlin?" And John answers, "Used to be the Brit working class's daft idea of a holiday." And in the background of this conversation, we can hear the man yelling, "Boofhead, where are you, mutt?" And then he says to himself, "He can't have fallen out." So it seems their dog has gone missing, which is actually pretty strange because they are on a dock that is on a beach that is pretty desolate. So there's not really a lot of places for the dog to get lost in. So while he's calling for the dog, Delvine has never heard of a place called the Butlins that British working class used to go to for holiday. So she asks, "When was that then? In the days of the British Empire?" And John kind of laughs and says, "Ha ha, England, my bloody old England." And as he says this, we cut to a little further down the beach where we see Sir Francis is walking into the water with the dog under his arm. And the dog is being held in a headlock, but it doesn't seem to be struggling or anything. Then we turn the page and we see Delvine is ready to leave with John on the boat, and the man has left the dock and he's calling for the dog farther away. But it seems she is captaining the boat and she doesn't need him to do that. So as she's untying the boat from the dock, she says to John, "I'm paid to run medical supplies out to the islands once a week. I take cigarettes and stuff too. What's your reason for going?" And John answers, "Me? I just want to get away from it all." And as the boat sets sail, John looks out at the ocean and his narration says, "More to the point, I want to get him away from it all. He's on a world tour, twisting the shit out of everything he passes. Reality coming apart. It's Dashwood's mind that's coming unstuck. I've got to get him to a very remote place where he can't hurt any more people with his insanity. Maybe he was once a nice fellow to have a drink with, but then I expect that's what they'll all say about me. Still, everything's holding together. He can't be too close." And in the panels under this narration, we see John is lighting a cigarette and he has a Zippo lighter that has an engraving of a tree being wrapped around by a giant snake. And as we turn the page, almost in answer to John saying that there wasn't anything weird going on, we see that Sir Francis has tied himself to a rope underneath the boat, and he's being pulled along under the ocean along with the dog. So Sir Francis must have killed this dog because it is now underwater with Sir Francis and it's not moving at all. And we see the name of this issue is Warped Notions Part 4, Mountain of Madness. Then we turn the page and we cut to their boat pulling into a dock on Papua New Guinea. And we can see there's a bunch of locals on the docks as well. And I'm assuming they're there to pick up all the supplies that Delvine has brought them. So over this panel, John's narration says, "The solution to all man's ills is growing in the rainforest," she said naively. "So I'm going there to find it." And who he's talking about here is the unnamed woman who seemed to be running the second group of people that were trying to get John on their side from the Church of Virtual Reality. And it seems like he's taking some of her advice, even though he said she was naive. Then he quotes the other people from the Church of Virtual Reality, but it seems John doesn't remember any of their names, so his narration says, "Your feet on the ground, your head in the clouds. That's the proper place for an occultist," someone else said. Then the other one, the mutilated goddess. "The sickness of civilization lies in its failure to incorporate the primitive," she said. "So I'll incorporate it." So it seems he has come here for a reason, specifically to use the environment of the rainforest against Sir Francis Dashwood. So while John is waiting around on the dock, he notices some of the local women who walk around topless, and as he looks at them, his narration says, "And if I'm whistling out my arse and Dashwood hasn't followed me, I'll woo a local girl and spend the rest of me life eating berries and chasing birds of paradise." Then as John looks at the breasts of the woman next to him, he says, "Maybe I'll just stay down here and settle down." And Delvine hears this because he's standing pretty close to her, and she notices that John is looking at a local woman's breasts, and she looks at him and says, "Yeah, you do that. They look great now. Give them 10 years, and they'll look more like a couple of potatoes hanging in the ends of nylon stockings." And John looks back at her and replies, "Seems to me that women are more obsessed with the size of breasts than any fella I've ever met." Then Delvine looks over at a local man who has a large animal horn tied around his waist that is covering his penis, and she motions to John and says, "Works the other way around too," meaning men are more obsessed with their penis size than women are. So Delvine finishes loading up all the supplies to the local people, and she's talking to them, and John notices that some of the locals are dressed in what look like ceremonial garb. So they have jewelry on their nose and ears, and they also have headdresses on. And John's narration says, "I'm so wrapped up in my thoughts, it doesn't even occur to me that the locals have taken off their baseball caps and put on their traditional glad rags just for me. Or to be precise, another prophet of doom's got wind of something happening. Gods have got to be either thanked or appeased. In either case, put a feather in your nose and go down to the jetty and do a jig." So even though John hasn't noticed that the locals have put this ceremonial garb on for him, Delvine can definitely tell that something's going on with the attitude of the locals towards John. So she goes over to John and says, "I don't get it. They think you're General MacArthur and brought back God's chewing gum. I know these people. I took over for the boat run for my father. It's not like they've been cut off from the world for 50 years. On the other hand, up in the mountains, maybe you'll still find natives who are well out of it." And while she's talking, John lights a cigarette and he says to her, "So, it's all that cargo cult stuff. What can I give them?" And Delvine answers, "I've got some cartons of cigarettes." And at this, John smiles a big smile and he says, "The second coming of Johnny Silkcut." But just as he says that, all of a sudden, a World War II style plane appears in the sky. And it's one of the old propeller fighter planes. And Delvine sees this and she says, "Bloody oath, how did that happen?" And John looks up at it questioningly, and then she says, "It's the old P-40 wreck from the mountain. It's been unreachable since the Second World War. Sometimes when the rain fills the creeks up, you can almost get up to it, but it's dangerous. I can't see how the wind could have lifted it up like that. Oh my God, it's flying." Then we cut to inside the cockpit and we see the person flying it is a skeleton pilot. So it seems this is more mischief happening because of Sir Francis Dashwood. And of course, Delvine just originally thought that somehow the wind had picked up this aircraft and it was just gliding down from the mountain. But when she yells it's flying, it's because it's actually like turning and steering. And it actually turns and steers directly at them. So as the plane dives down towards them, John is able to yell a little joke saying, "It's Biggles himself. It's coming right for us." And Delvine yells, "I don't think it's going to turn away. Jump!" And the plane barely misses them as it crash lands into the part of the dock behind them. And as they were trying to get away, Delvine actually pushed John so that he would get down faster, and he fell in the water. So as Delvine pulls him out, John says, "I knew it. He's nearby, watching me." And Delvine asks, "Who is? What's going on?" And John sits on the dock and looks up at her and says, "Do you believe in magic?" And Delvine answers, "You mean like hocus pocus, bees and locusts?" And John answers, yeah, just like that. Look, I've got to go. I've got to lead him up into the mountain." And as John stands up, she says, "You'll never make it up there on your own, matey. I'm going to have to show you the way. There's drop bears in the trees." And John seems kind of confused by this and says, "Huh?" And she continues, "And when you pick a prickly pear, beware." And it seems she's messing with him because at first John buys it, but then he realizes what that's from and he says, "That's from the Jungle Book." And she gives him a little smile and then she walks away towards the boat and she says, "I'll pack you some stuff then. You palms can't last 2 minutes without insect repellent." Then we turn the page and we see Delvine is walking John through the jungle towards the locals' village. And John's narration says, "It used to be called jungle. Now you've got to say rainforest. I'll get as deep into it as I can before I force a confrontation. But every time I get to thinking a person would have to be daft to come this far, suddenly there's a clearing and a crowd of giggling children." So John and Delvine walk into the clearing that is the village, and the local children begin to gather around them and play, and Delvine says to John, "Haha, don't mind the ankle biters." Then we cut to them sometime later as Delvine and John are sitting with some locals inside of a hut, and it seems the locals have prepared for them a bunch of fruit for them to eat. And Delvine is saying to John, "You know, some people think that the Highland people are a morbid lot. Up here, the most important day of your life is the day you die. After that, people start taking more notice of your opinions. Nobody scratches their bum around here without analyzing a chicken's gut first to get the ancestral view on the matter. And from what I hear, some of the dead can be difficult bastards to deal with." And Delvine cuts into a fruit to give a piece to John, and he says, "Same everywhere. No matter how easygoing the old man was in life, he'll be cranky as blazes in death." Then we cut to later that night where John is just standing out in the open in the middle of the village, and he's smoking and he's looking up at the sky. And his narration says, "Nighttime is crazy up in the tropics. Insects set up a bleeding din that would wake up all the dead ancestors in the South Seas. It's an awe-inspiring roar. Wembley terraces on Cup final day don't come close. But I've heard crickets before. This time there's something else out there. A madness rising out of the night-wet grass. It's palpable like the humidity. I can feel insects filling my lungs." And as his narration says this, we do see a giant cloud of insects forming behind John, and they actually do attack his head, and I guess he breathes them in because they do, in fact, fill his lungs. And I guess Delvine heard this because as John falls down to the ground coughing, Delvine runs over to him and says, "John, what's happening?" And then she is swarmed too. Then we turn the page and we cut to morning. And both John and Delvine had passed out and are just barely waking up. And as John begins to push himself to his feet, he vomits, and what comes out is a bunch of bugs. And then Delvine begins to move as well, and she also vomits. And of course, as John looks down at this pile of bugs and liquid, he of course is freaked out. So they stand up and they look around and they notice that the village is really quiet as well. They find some of the toys that the children were playing with abandoned on the ground. And Delvine doesn't like the look of this, and she says, "The place is deserted, John." Then she leads John over to a crevice in a stone wall, and she begins to squeeze into it, and John asks, "What's through there? The villagers?" And Delvine replies, "None that are still living." Then they both squeeze through the crevice and walk into a cave, and John is kind of freaked out immediately because there are dead bodies that are on display through these wood cages. And Delvine sees that John is freaked out, so she explains, "It's just the ancestors. They used to keep these shrines out in the open. Now, they're more inclined to keep the missionaries quiet, and all the other busybodies too. They stopped hanging their enemies' heads in the trees long ago, but they still keep these tambu sites in secret corners. I like to think their ancestors are really here, maybe whistling their thoughts between those two rocks." Then John quotes one of the members of the Church of Virtual Reality saying, "The feeble membranes that separate life from death, the real from the unreal." And Delvine looks at John questioningly, and John says, "Just something a bloke said." Then they begin to walk further into the cave, and as they do, they come upon a bunch of the bodies of the villagers. And John says, "Oh no, Delvine, look, they're all here, every one of them." And Delvine says, Whatever killed them, why didn't it kill us too? And John goes over to one of the kids, and he had been carrying one of the dolls that they made, so he leaves it with one of the dead bodies of the children, and he answers Delvine's question saying, because it needs me. Then from behind John, someone says, and at last you are found. And as John turns around, he sees that it's Sir Francis's ghost, and Sir Francis is standing with a smile, and he says to John, unreality was too much for some of them. The rest, they died of fright. And Delvine sees Sir Francis, and she yells out, a ghost! But Sir Francis doesn't seem to care about her. He just holds his glass of wine up to John and says, the first glass for myself, the second for my friends, the third for good humor, and the fourth is for mine enemies. Then he takes a big drink, and John's narration says, I can't tell whether the old buzzard knows I'm onto him. Can't even tell if he knows the score himself. And John asks Sir Francis out loud, which glass are we up to then? And Sir Francis answers, this, Mr. Constantine, is neither claret nor the nectar of the gods. The great alchemist Paracelsus left on record a quaint recipe where, by a peculiar treatment of certain sporadic substances, he could produce a homunculus, or artificial man. And just as he says this, all of a sudden the dog that Sir Francis had stolen from the guy in Australia comes out from the shadows, and we can see that its head has been removed and replaced with one of the skulls of the ancestors that were on display earlier in the cave. So it seems Sir Francis has made a homunculus with the body of the dog that he killed and the skull of one of the ancestors. And Delvine sees the dog, and I think she actually knew this dog because it belonged to the man at the dock, who she definitely knows. So she screams out, and as the homunculus gets closer to John, he doesn't freak out. He actually calmly and collectively kicks the head off the thing, and the body of the dog immediately crumbles to the ground. And John stares up at Sir Francis angry, and Sir Francis looks at him and says, but enough of this. We must turn back to our mission. Reality is at stake. We must complete our circumnavigation of the globe. And then with his pointer finger, he mimics a circle in the air, and a circle actually appears out of what looks like ghostly fire. And as he's drawing the circle, he says, the circle is a hole, but also a hole. And then he points to the middle of it with his finger. So he's saying that the circle being complete is a good thing, but also it will literally be a hole in reality. And Sir Francis continues, the nothing, which contains the potential existence of everything. A magic circle. And John replies, a vicious circle, more like it. Then as we turn to the next page, we see John and Delvine are already leaving the cave, and John is pulling her by the arm, yelling, Delvine, run! Don't ask questions and don't look back. So I guess John had enough of pretending, so he's run away from Sir Francis, kind of giving away that he knows Sir Francis is evil. So as John and Delvine begin to go through the woods, John stops and says, give me your knife. And Delvine replies, he's a ghost. What good's a knife? But John doesn't have time to explain, and he yells back, the knife. So she gives it to him, and then he points and says, you head that way. And then he runs in the opposite direction in the jungle. And as Delvine watches John run away, she says, okay, it's your problem. Look me up when you've sorted it out. I assume that means that she has kind of a thing for John, or possibly she just wants to know if John survived the whole thing. So we cut to John running through the jungle, and then we cut to Sir Francis, who's just leaving the cave now, and he's following John's path, and he's yelling, Mr. Constantine, I do not understand, but he's cut off as he trips over the root of a tree. And he's surprised by this, of course, and he falls, and then he stands up confused and looks at his hands. Because, of course, he's a ghost and he shouldn't be able to trip over a tree. Meanwhile, John, who's a little ways ahead, is looking up at the large trunk of a tree, and he says, this one'll do. Then we cut back to Sir Francis as he's now leaping through trees trying to catch up to Constantine, so it seems he's gotten his ghost abilities back. Then we cut to John and we see he is carving lots of symbols and other religious iconography, and just underneath all of that, he carves a very large slash at a 45-degree angle down the trunk of the tree. Then John pulls out his lighter, and he lights himself a cigarette. Then he turns the lighter over and removes the stopper that is used to refill the lighter fluid in the lighter. And he pours lighter fluid down that 45-degree slash he made. And as he does this, he peeks out and he sees Sir Francis is right on the other side of this tree, but does not see John yet. And as Sir Francis begins to walk through the tree, we see that the trunk is big enough that Sir Francis's whole body can fit inside of it, and then there's even a little bit more room, and then he would come out the other side. So just as he walks into it, John very quickly lights the lighter fluid in the 45-degree cut that he made, and then he takes the knife and continues that cut with the fire trailing behind it all the way around the trunk in a spiral. And as he does this, John says, "Must get this right. No second chance. 9 times around." And from inside the tree, we can hear Sir Francis say, "Hold! What are you doing? I'm in the dark." So it seems he's being held there even though the spell isn't 100% finished until John does the 9 times around. So as he's going around the tree, John says, "I've locked you up, mate. You've had it. Put it this way. By the time they log this forest, the world will probably need a good knock in the head." And Sir Francis calls from the tree, "What? I'm here for all time." And as John finishes the 9th time around and pats at his sleeve because it did catch fire, he says, "I can't begin to imagine what kind of power you'd have gained from this spell of yours, this circling the planet, or why a spirit cares about lording it over the rest of creation. Me? I'd be content to wander around the fields of Asphodel, sniffing the daisies with all the other inmates of the afterlife. You fooled everybody, Dashwood, unless Franklin and the goddess and Puss in Boots were all figments of your imagination too, and I'm starting to think they were." And Sir Francis from the tree says, "Ah, yes. Resolute imagination is the beginning of all magical operations. That's Paraclesis again." And then John rips off the rest of his burnt sleeve and he throws it at the tree and says, "Fuck Paraclesis. You're on your own now." And then John begins to walk away. And as he does, Sir Francis says, "Wait, I'm already missing my clarinet. And what about my carpet slippers? What did I do that was wrong?" And upon hearing this, John turns around and says, "You were a bad influence." Then John takes out a cigarette and he tries to light it, but of course he used all the lighter fluid in his Zippo, so it will not light. So he takes the lighter and the unused cigarette and he puts it in his front shirt pocket. And as he does this, the narration says, "I always figured if I got through life without adding any more bullocks to the world's sum total of bullocks, then I could hold me head high and say I wasn't part of it. Now I've gone and done what all the self-righteous fat bastards are doing, taken our madness and dumped it where it isn't wanted. One more reason I can't look at myself in the mirror in the morning." And then John comes to the edge of the jungle and he stares out at the ocean, and that is the end of the issue. And also, like I said, the end of the Eddie Campbell arc. So next time we'll be starting the Paul Jenkins run, which I believe lasts for 40 issues or so. And pretty much everything that we've read so far, I have read at some point or another, but I don't remember anything about the Paul Jenkins run. Although I know I read at least half of it. So I can't wait to get into it again, and especially with all the stuff that we just read and all of the Jamie Delano and Garth Ennis stuff fresh in my mind, it should be a good run. So with that, if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see y'all in the next one.